Alright, now that we're all kind of finding our groove again on this channel, I figured we'd kind of... Because there felt something a little bit tedious about kind of doing movies one at a time like that. I'm much more comfortable with this sort of grouped together weekly thing. So I'm assuming we'll be back in this format, which is a relief, at least to me. So we do have three here that I want to talk about, all which have gotten major nominations throughout the past week, whether in just one category or across. And I want to start with probably the more unexpected movie to have emerged in that group, which is The Little Things, which is a movie that I was already really excited for, though I knew I didn't have necessarily a lot of reasons to be, that being because you look at the cast list and the storyline, where it's the two detectives who are on this case, and then a major suspect appears about at the halfway point. And it sounds like a very basic story, which would be where the reservations come in. But the two cops are Denzel and Rami Malek, and the suspect is Jared Leto in really campy territory. So, and I know a lot of people, like, it's been really popular lately to hate on Jared Leto because of both Suicide Squad and just how really weirdly pretentious he seems in real life. But that kind of stuff tends to seem to make people forget how incredible of an actor he can be, especially when he's bringing his own creativity into it, which he, to my understanding, did quite a bit with this character. And you can kind of tell that there's sort of things. Apparently, there's more written for Leto's character than it would seem, but that also comes in with the writer-director, who is John Lee Hancock, who is another one of my sort of reservations, because while he's made movies that are fine, that seems to pretty much be what he's known for, is everything he's done is okay. So it's like when you have this insane group of three people, all you can put Academy Award winner on every name on the poster. It's like, with the kind of story that it is, it's like, it's gonna really come from what the actors do. It's gonna be what any kind of worthwhile thing is gonna be in this way, because it's gonna be a story we pretty much already know, and the direction is going to be competent at best, and... But the problem with this, though, is that usually with stories like this, even if they're, really run-of-the-mill or whatever, you can still get pretty wrapped up in them if it's well-made enough, or if, the performances are intriguing enough, or whatever. And while I usually feel like, I would never say, like, Denzel was unreliable at any point. So I definitely think it has more to do with the character as to why I wasn't really into the first hour of this or so, where it basically just felt like sort of a prolonged Law and Order episode, with the first entire half being without a suspect. Because obviously, even when I'm not even a fan of those, like, any of the Law and Order shows. They just they feel so repetitive, and it's boring to me. But there is that structure where it's all just the usual procedural stuff, and then the real meat of the story is going to come in when we get, like, a main suspect, which is usually played by a familiar face. And that's pretty much exactly the way this movie works, just with the 2-hour structure instead of the 1-hour structure. But still at the same thing, like, the halfway point is when Leto comes into it. But before we get to him, I think another reason it doesn't really... It felt like there were a few things going on here that didn't really work for the first half. Not only did it just feel like this really routine procedural that wasn't really that interesting, but it felt just really awkwardly put together. Like when... Because obviously Denzel's going from one place to another and kind of bringing himself into this investigation, so he's kind of almost out of his element in regards to how everybody else is sort of interacting here. Like, he's kind of an outsider. But they're clearly, like, forcing a backstory on us, where it's that thing where he'll just get really sort of contemplative, and we'll see flashes of an old case that he had, and they keep talking about it cryptically for almost the entire movie. And it's like, when you do the cryptic thing for that long, sooner or later, like, it's meant to pique interest and make you wonder about the character and kind of add a mystery around him that you're hoping to see unravel, and that's what draws you in. But when you're doing the cryptic thing for so long, after a while, you just don't care, because it's like, what kind of payoff could there be that pays this off? And the movie does go down that road, but to not say too much, we'll put the focus now on Rami Malek. And the problem here is that I had heard um, somebody whose opinions I really respect said something before I saw the movie that I was kind of trying to keep out of my head, which was they thought that Rami Malek was miscast. Like, it's not that he's bad in it, and it's not necessarily that the character's weak, just that he might be miscast. And I can kind of see that, but there's also moments in the later half where um, Malik does stuff that really works for me. Just like these small things, like when as it goes on, he's the one that's getting more and more fed up with them not being able to catch Leto in the act or find any sliver of evidence, and while Leto's just kind of playing with them the whole time. And then there's this one moment where he and Denzel are like staking him out, and it gets to just another night of nothing happened, still no proof, and just in this little fit of frustration, he punches the car window, and it looks like it hurts him, but he's like playing it off, and it's like this really weird, real moment. Like it feels so realistic of a moment. Like even Denzel seems surprised that he reacted that way, and it's like he's trying to play off in his anger, that like genuinely was not the best call, but stuff like that's kind of few and far between. I think a lot of the problem with the first half is, despite moments like that, there's not really a chemistry. I didn't sense a chemistry between Denzel and Rami Malek that definitely feels like it should be there. Like when they do the whole thing where like he has Denzel over to his place for like breakfast and stuff like that. Um, but I don't know. There's just something about the back and forth here that just didn't. It felt kind of empty. And I think another problem with the Mallet character is that he does have an arc happening, but it's like really late before we realize that. Like it's, and maybe this is just me being slow, I don't know, but it's it felt like for a while the cuts back to him were just kind of there to remind us that the character existed, because it was like the more it kept going, the more it was like Denzel on this investigation seemed like enough, and it almost felt like Malik's character was one character too many. Like we had an extra character for some reason, and it obviously turns out that there is a reason, but it is like by the time we get to his character's arc, it doesn't feel as earned as it probably should. Like when we're in the third act, I really feel like these would be really great. Like these scenes would have much more depth to them if this arc felt more earned. But it's like we got a couple of things here and there, where we just get shots of Malik like just kind of by himself, and he kind of is at a distance in his home life. Like there's a point in time where we're getting some when we're really getting into the meat of the Leto stuff, and there's this long sequence in the middle where the movie kind of is really kind of starting to take off finally, where it's just Denzel by himself, just following Leto around like all day, and then into the night. Um, and then when this sequence ends and it cuts back to a scene of Rami Malek's wife, she wakes up and the bed's empty, and she goes, to the back door, and he's just kind of sitting outside, just kind of stewing over this case. And it's like, that's us getting some of the background on where Malik's mindset is that's going to be important later, but it's like, when they cut away from the Denzel Leto stuff to show us Malik's home life, as crucial as it's going to be to the story, it still felt like this isn't what we want to see though. Like the Denzel Leto stuff, that's probably the direction the movie should be going. Because the Malik stuff feels kind of too little too late when it starts to become crucial. So that's yeah. I feel like that maybe if there could have been like some sort of balance or something, or give Denzel's character the traits of Malik's character without the backstory that they keep bringing in. But there's still moments where the backstory adds a little something where it's like the idea of this movie being something very run of the mill and something that we've seen so many times before. It did feel a little new to a story like this that's so basic. That a lot of the early Denzel scenes feel a lot more contemplative than we're used to in this, where it's not a lot of dialogue or even really a lot of exposition. Surprisingly, that's kind of a relief and something that probably should get more credit for. Um, but it just has moments of just kind of Denzel just seemingly remembering a full history, just kind of by himself in a room. And it's like that's the kind of thing you don't see too much in stories like this that are usually all about getting to the point. But once we see like what the points are, then it becomes clear that they probably had something strong enough that it could have been a bit more. But I think another reason the early stuff may not work is there's the whole thing of when you crumble early and it impacts everything afterwards that maybe could have been good. Like I said, how everything feels awkwardly put together. Like the awkward interactions that are like really brief when Denzel's just kind of running into like from person to person, and we get these clumsy intros of people that just come in and out of the story that don't really have any particular importance. Like and the editing feels off. Like some scenes feel like they kind of cut off too early, and it's like we're bouncing around too much in one scene. And this is the kind of thing you really shouldn't notice. But it felt like continuity errors were everywhere. Which is another thing that kind of goes into the editing also. And that's like in the first 20 minutes or so. So it's all feeling really jumbled anyway. So by the time we're getting, glimpses of a Denzel backstory and he's, talking to his ex and stuff like that, like I said, all the cryptic stuff just feels kind of, desperate to get the audience's attention rather than sort of naturally pulling us in. So, yeah. But there is a shot that's like amazing when we're transitioning because there's always that thing where when you transition from Denzel being contemplative to the flashback of his old case, that's just gonna be lame and obvious and cheap or whatever. So they did this incredible transition when Denzel's in present day and he's like following Leto around and he looks at the side mirror on his car and the scene of him on his old case at the crime scene, the whole scene, that whole image is in the side mirror of his car. And it's like, that's really awesome, an awesome transition into that, okay. But, like, that's about as, like, that's kind of the peak of the sort of visual storytelling of of the movie. Like, there's nothing that creative pretty much ever again. But it's nice while it's there. So, to talk about Leto, um, it does. I can see a criticism where when he comes into it, it does feel like it's suddenly a completely different movie. And what's interesting about that is you get that feel already when he hasn't even said anything yet. Like when before he's even introduced, Denzel goes into the place where he works. Asks a few questions because we're still in procedural mode, and then he leaves. And then Leto, our first shot of Leto is this scene, and he kind of just peeks out from behind a curtain, really ominously. And it's like, even in that one shot, where he doesn't say anything, he just looks out from behind a curtain, it already feels like it's turning into another movie than it was for the last hour. Um, but kind of a better one, and a more riveting one, as it comes in, because like I said, there's so many things that he brings, um, to the movie, like a really weird sense of humor and this seemingly weird obsession with food. Like he's the kind of guy where Rami Malek calls him up and says, "Hey, we're gonna go to this bar and we're gonna meet because I've got some questions for you." And his response is, "Isn't that the place with the potato skins?" And Malek just hangs up on him. And it's like he throws in stuff like that, and obviously there's gonna be a great interrogation. The interrogation scene's like one of his first kind of real scenes. Um, and there's definitely something there. He was saying in one of his interviews recently about how he would. I'm not sure if any of this is actually in the movie, but there are times where he just do little moments of improv, and with Jared Leto that could be anything. It could be great or it could be not so great. But the way he tells it is that whenever he would kind of do this, like he'd just throw a line out that was unscripted, Denzel would immediately catch it and throw something back at him, and it was like this really sort of great back and forth thing. And it's like you can definitely, when I was talking about the lack of chemistry with Denzel and Rami Malek, there's definitely something between Denzel and Leto, and even something between Malek and Leto in the later scenes. So that's another thing he brings to this movie is he brings out such a life in the characters that were already here. And like I was saying in our awards video yesterday, was it's like this is Denzel and Rami Malek. Like I said, Denzel is just like the god in this scenario, and then obviously Rami Malek is incredible too. Like in general, so the fact that Leto can come in and take characters that they've already established for the last hour and breathe so much life into this movie that wasn't there, that says a lot about what Leto's bringing to the table. It's like the fact that he's propping this whole movie up when Denzel and Rami Malek are the stars of it. That's something I never would have foreseen if you just kind of said it on paper that would happen in a movie recently. But here it is, and he was even like. And like, even when you get vibes of like maybe we've seen this character before too, like there were times where he was giving me like his voice and speech patterns, especially in like the interrogation scene, at times were reminding me of like Crispin Glover. But it still feels like a pretty unique character, especially dropping him into this movie, where he feels like it makes sense that it feels like he's from an entirely different movie because it feels like he's from an entirely different world, and these two detectives just have no idea what to do with it. Like, so that really adds something else. And like I said, any of the scenes of like Denzel just following Leto around are just, yeah, this is what the movie should be. But like I said, we kind of get glimpses of it here and there, where it pulls us in, and yeah, but like I said, this is all under the competent direction of Hancock, and it's like this is the kind of thing that needs a really strong director behind it. Like the whole thing about how apparently he wrote this for like Spielberg in the 90s, because it's set in 1990, which kind of adds an interesting kind of thing here where we don't kind of have the modern technology. That kind of makes the story feel old fashioned in a way that's pretty welcome, but yeah, I do wonder though how, especially the tension, how much more we could have had of that, with a director that kind of has a better grasp on that kind of thing and isn't just sort of, hey, I can do my job, but it's like it would have been great to have a director that can do their job like to greatness, which is something we haven't seen from Hancock yet. But this is an interesting direction for him to go down. Like I said, there's some inspired things in here also. Like I said, even if the story does feel very familiar, I was getting a lot of vibes of The Pledge, many vibes of The Pledge, and then the third act was kind of giving me vibes of another movie's climax, which I won't say what movie that is because that's probably saying too much. But it is a movie that Denzel turned down, interestingly enough. So, so I think that's pretty much what this is. So, yeah, I think there is something here in that it could have been much more generic than it was, like with some inspired things here and there. But for the most part, the main takeaway is that the first hour is like a massive kind of slog, even with Denzel and Rami Malek in front of it. And then it's this sort of second half where we kind of really jump into something. And that's the thing also about how what Leto's doing here is so great is the fact that he leaves such an impression. It might almost be one of those cases where you forget how much of a slog the first hour was, and you'll come away from the movie much more positively than you probably should. because that's what you're going to remember this movie as is the Leto scenes. So we do have. I imagine a lot of people are up in arms about the last scene, like the very last scene of it. And what's interesting about that is that's definitely something that I can see leaving a bad taste for a lot of people. And it's like, it kind of feels like they're just fucking with us just to fuck with us. And it can seem like really transparent in a way to just whatever. But I actually think it's growing on me a little more. The more now that I see the big picture and the full picture, and it's not just something they like sneak up on you and do, but when you see it as a whole thing from the beginning to end, the very last scene is growing on me a little more, and I can get a little bit more of why that would be the last scene rather than just something cynical like they just wanted to fuck with us for the sake of it. So yeah. Um, so let's go on to the second movie, which is News of the World, which is the reuniting of Tom Hanks and Paul Greengrass. But the thing about this is that, well, I guess the first thing I want to say is this is the kind of movie where I don't know how accurately I feel about it, if that makes sense, because this is one of the few movies that's like made me long for a theater screen since we've kind of been in this area of time where it's like I do think that this is one of the few cases where I think that would make a significant difference maybe, where it's because a movie like this kind of really shrunk down to the size of like a TV or a laptop or something, um, isn't going to necessarily have like the sweeping effect that it might when you have like the really large places and landscapes that this whole thing is set in that kind of give you this whole vibe of being in this world that's in like the 1870s, and in this it's like war torn, like we're after the Civil War and all that, and there's an essence here that probably isn't going to come through in the format that most of us are going to see it through. So I'm trying to kind of be lenient towards that when talking about this. But one thing I do want to mention that I don't apparently have a problem with that many people do, because I haven't watched trailers for the last however many years. Apparently, this is another movie where it's getting a lot of complaints that it's not what it seemed to be advertised as. Like, I guess people were seeing it as like an action western sort of thing. Um, and while there are action scenes in it, it doesn't feel like an action movie, really at all, with the exception of like one scene. But even if you don't look at advertisements, maybe you get that vibe from Paul Greengrass's name. That tends to be what you associate it with. Is like tension and stuff like that, and suspense and action and all that. But I wasn't really. The thing about it was I didn't know what the story was for the longest time. I only knew the title and that it was Tom Hanks' new movie. And even being a Paul Greengrass movie, I wasn't. Just the title alone, I wasn't thinking your average Paul Greengrass movie. Like, that was gonna just always be in my head, like, before I even knew what the movie was. And I think that helped a lot in regards to expectations. Because another thing was, it's the reuniting of Tom Hanks and Paul Greengrass. And the thing is that you would think I'm, like, okay, you have to be as good as Captain Phillips now. That's been established. But it's like, I love Captain Phillips so much, and the fact that this movie did seem like it was going to be much more downplayed just based on the title alone and what I was imagining, it was never in my head to say, like, alright, this has to be on par with Captain Phillips. Like, I was never sort of comparing them or giving it some sort of expectation to reach, because, quite honestly, before I knew anything about the story, I saw Tom Hanks and I saw the title News of the World. I kind of just assumed it was another movie like The Post or something. And I think that did wonders for my expectations I think that saved this movie for me because I wasn't expecting some, True Grit like thing or some action movie or, something in the style of Greengrass's other movies or anything like that. So I didn't really know what to expect going in, but that's I said that had to help a lot. That's where my expectations were. So going in, we do have it is something that feels sort of unique, following a character that does what he does, where he goes just sort of from town to town by himself. They're kind of cryptic about his home life or where he's coming from and all that. We know where he's coming from, like in regards to the war, but like his personal life, where he has a picture of his wife that he keeps close to him and stuff like that. Um, and people know him, from here and there or wherever. And he just goes around and informs them of the news because that's how people are going to get it. But it's the way he sort of interacts with the people, and it's like he has this way where Tom Hanks is kind of the perfect casting choice because he has like this kind of, you get the sense that he's like really seen shit and he's like really worn down by life and the world and stuff like that. But when he goes from these places, there's a warmth somewhere inside of him that comes out to where even though he's in these towns briefly, these interactions that he has are so sort of personal. Even though he's talking to crowds, there's still that sort of the way he's informing them and the way he interacts with them, where he makes them laugh, but he also informs them, and he feels like whenever he's here, like he's a part of this town and has always been a part of this town, even though he's just passing through. Which I feel like is this really important character trait, especially for where the story goes. When he meets the girl, who's here after this clear altercation that's ended in violence and death, and he realizes that he has to get this girl back to wherever she belongs, wherever that is. He's gonna figure that out as he goes along. Um, and that's the thing also is that's the strength I feel like Hanks brings to this. But in the past number of years now, Hanks seems to have been known for kind of taking a back seat with his star power and sort of propping up his co-stars like Barkad Abdi or Mark Rylance, and now in this case, Helena Zengel, who is the little girl. And the thing about her is, like, I had heard kind of rumblings, like people were saying, like, oh man, she's like incredible in this, and like I think Greengrass said something at the directors roundtable about how she was one of those cases where they might as well have just stopped auditions when she came in, and so there was the rumblings of like, wow, it'd be great if she got awards consideration, but like that'll happen, and here she is now with two big nominations so far, and I can see that, and I think with a story like this and her getting awards consideration and being a young girl, the Haley Steinfeld comparisons are going to be inevitable. But like I was saying in the awards video, it's really two opposite things, where the strength of Haley Steinfeld's performance was her dialogue and how she delivered it, whereas Engel has hardly any dialogue at all to work with because there's like the language barrier, and she's almost there's kind of that distance between them, and they're almost kind of they're like teaching each other's language just in these little tiny snippets. So for the most part, all of her stuff is like kind of emotion based and just sort of watching her expressions and how she reacts to things, whether it be fear or desperation or sadness or longing or whatever it is, and they're all here. And there's that really comes to light in one specific scene where they come across a house that's empty, ominously empty, and we just kind of watch her sort of walk around, and it's and just the way she sees this, and you can kind of get the vibe that, because there's always the question, and they question this, like there's a whole scene devoted to questioning this towards the end of the movie. Um, the question of does she always know what's going on or not? And she really kind of adds an ambiguity to that really well that may not stand out immediately because it's not through dialogue. So that's a real strength of the movie as well, and then the back and forth between the two of them. Um, and yeah, talking about how it is as far as what's gonna draw you in, because obviously the movie's gonna be very episodic as he goes from town to town, and they run into certain like brief antagonists or something. And there's only like the only like overarch of the whole thing is getting her to wherever she might belong. and any sort of antagonism or any obstacle they face in between is just going to kind of be contained to one or two scenes before they move on to the next thing. And I never really have ever minded episodic stories the way some people do. Like a lot of people really need that sort of overarching thing. But my go-to example is always The Godfather, being one of the most episodic movies of all time, and that's what makes it. That's one of the many things that makes it great, I think. Have these sort of self-contained moments throughout it, and so there is a moment like right in the middle of the movie where we have a shootout, and it's like in any other movie this would be a climax. Like this doesn't like it doesn't have the feel of a mid-movie shootout because mid-movie shootouts, the stakes are kind of limited. But this feels like a climax, and it's barely. It might not even be an hour in, and that I feel like that kind of shows just how well staged that was. But with the exception of like a pretty obvious CGI rock, that's kind of there's some obvious CGI here and there throughout it. That's kind of unfortunate, but doesn't really take too much away from it. But shortly after the shootout, I was starting to think that the structure was kind of reminding me a little bit of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, where there are many moments that kind of feel like they're self-contained moments, and then like it's kind of the middle of the movie that feels like it would be working towards some sort of class, or like the middle of Butch and Sundance feels like this continuous chase, but then there's the entire other side of that that's just sort of not that. I feel like their structures are, if not similar, like comparable at least. And of course, with Zingel's character, there's obviously going to be inevitable comparisons to Dances with Wolves, which aren't unwarranted. So there is that. But like I said, there's still enough things in here that feel unique enough. Like I said, following the kind of character that he is, and the way that it's structured, where the action is in it, and how it's not constant at all. If anything, it's almost barely there, and just mainly prominent in kind of this center scene. But I said I don't really mind that because there are some things that kind of make it feel like a whole product, like the idea of these scenes. And some people may chalk this up to like repetitiveness or redundancy or something, but it's almost kind of bookended in two similar scenes where he loses sight of her, where in about 20 minutes in, it's rain and kind of a storm like that, and then towards the end, before we get into kind of the final moments, it's a dust storm. And like there's something really almost symmetrical about this that just kind of feels right, I guess. So yeah, stuff like that. Like I said, I can see being criticized, but I think it works. And I saw some complaints about it being predictable, which is interesting because there's kind of a somewhat side story going on with Hanks that they kind of keep hinting at that has a reveal, but I kind of felt like that was obvious the whole time. But what's interesting about people saying the movie is predictable is I kind of had somewhat of an ending in my head pretty much from about 15 minutes in. And the ending that I had in my head is not where it went. So, it's, so while the ending as is might seem obvious to a lot of people, I was kind of thinking the opposite would be where we were. So I didn't really find the ending that predictable. So there's that. I would say if one thing, as far as its episodic nature, would be that we have like a sequence where he has to chase her through the rain because she thinks she sees her people or where she came from, and then we have the altercation that leads to the shootout. Then we have another altercation where he kind of has to decide through the news that he reads what he's going to do, and if he reads the news as he does and doesn't follow this other guy's rules, there could be another violent altercation. And then the dust storm, and then our final moments. By the time you get to the end, it doesn't feel like a lot. Like, for a movie that feels as sort of big visually as it does, when it's all over and you kind of add it up, there's something kind of slight about it. But I do think that that's another one of those things, like I was talking about the little things, where when you have the full picture in your mind, it might help. Though in this one, it might hinder just a little bit if you were expecting more. And like I said, this seems to be what makes or breaks this movie is people's expectations from it. So if you were lucky enough, like me, to pretty much have none, it works. But it seems to have kind of been the death of it for a lot of people, or at least the mild wounding of it for a lot of people. But I don't think it's great or anything, but I do think it's fine. I could see myself watching it again, like somewhere down the road. Um, yeah, like if there's nothing else. But I mean, I wouldn't, begrudgingly watch it again. So, um, yeah. So let's go on to our last movie, which is One Night in Miami, which is it's written by Ken Powers and it's based on his play, and it's one of those cases where you can tell that it's based on a play, but like I was talking about with like Ma Rainey, that kind of thing usually doesn't bother me as long as like the characters and the performances are strong. But it is really hard for a director to find something to do with that, to bring life into it and not make it just necessarily feel like it's actors on a stage or whatever. But I was under the impression that it was set entirely in the location of the motel room. But what's interesting here is we do get like their individual intros, and then we kind of see that lead to this moment. So it's probably I could be off on this, but I want to say like maybe 15 or 20 minutes of it is the intros before we even get to the motel room, and then we get the meat of the movie and what we're here for. But these intros are very interesting in how we set up. Like we set up Ollie, and we get this really well filmed match between him and Sonny Liston. But there's also stuff like Aldous Hodge is playing Jim Brown, and there's things in these intros that like really importantly establish what's going on. Like you would think it would just be, oh, here's this character, and then once we have established the four of them, then we get this thing. But there's a lot of significant things established in these sort of opening scenes, and the one that stands out the most is this Jim Brown introduction, where Beau Bridges is in this scene, and Beau Bridges is like really kind to him, and they sit on the porch, and it's this really sort of heartwarming scene, and it was a brilliant idea to cast Beau Bridges for just this one scene, because Beau Bridges is one of those actors that just kind of brings a warmth with him, and it just really comes through in these moments where they have this conversation, and it's like just and I can almost see it being like if it was going to have like Green Book vibes, where people criticized Green Book because it kind of seemed a little too idealistic in its approach of the subject matter, and it seemed a little too almost happy ending storybook kind of thing. It wasn't really always getting into the meat and staying there for a long enough time to be as reach maximum impact. And so it feels like we're getting one of those scenes, like from one of those kind of movies. And then Beau Bridges just says something, and it's like it's like getting punched in the stomach really fucking hard. And it's the way, and this is what's interesting is, even though Aldous Hodge is here through the whole movie, and Jim Brown is a prominent character through the whole movie, this is probably the most important scene that he has. The way he plays this, with just an expression, to where they could have made this big, like a really big moment, but the nonchalance of the whole thing is how it makes the punch even harder. And that's, like I said, you can see it sort of trying, like it's trying to be optimistic at the start, and then it just sort of like, yeah. And so scenes like that where it's like, you immediately get the vibe, okay, there's going to be a power to this kind of story that we haven't seen in those other movies that attempt this subject matter but don't quite always get to the real core of it or the center of it. So as I was talking about in the awards video, what's really interesting about these four characters is that while Leslie Odom Jr. seems to be getting singled out in the awards race, I feel like there's equal footing here between all four of them, because you've got Leslie Odom Jr., you've got Kingsley Benadir, Aldous Hodge, who I mentioned, and Eli Gorey is Ollie, and he's the one I'm the least familiar with. But what's interesting about how they play this is, for starters, as a group, I don't really think there's a standout. Like, I've seen some people say Kingsley Benadir is kind of the standout because Malcolm's kind of the. It seems to get a little more focus than the other three, and Leslie Odom Jr. seems to have the big meaty part, especially. But I think it helps a lot also when you have someone who sings playing someone who sings. So he's going to be able to do the singing and the emotion in scenes that call for that, which is going to give him big moments. But I do feel like they're four wheels here, and like not having one of them, or one of them being lesser in regards to what they're bringing to the table, would have caused the whole thing to kind of go out of balance. And just on the opposite side of that, if somebody was much more of a standout than the others, there would still be kind of a balance. Like if three of them were really good and one of them was great, it's you need that balance where all four of them are just kind of equally have these moments that really make them all stand out in their own way, where it's like just when it seems like one is becoming the main focus, then the other will have a big moment, and it just kind of seems to go back and forth here, and it's this constant thing that keeps it balanced. And I think that's extremely important in itself, and I think that's also something that comes in with Regina King's direction, because some people might watch this and wonder why Regina King's getting the attention that she is, and she's one of the director nominees at the Globes. But the thing is usually when people are thinking about, what did a director do, they're thinking strictly visually. Like, they're just kind of looking at it aesthetically and going like, where's the direction, in quotes. But it's like when you've got four huge figures as your four main characters, there's a balance here you have to find that I would imagine was not easy. Like I said, but the four of them working together as sort of like one machine here, in equal parts, that's the real that kind of the hidden strength of the movie. That I don't think there is a particular standout amongst the four of them. And also when you're talking about the big figures here, and Kim Powers, whether it be the screenwriting or when he wrote the play, there's such a confidence in it, because though they're all big figures, it feels like the whole time like it's like four guys having like real conversations and debates. Because I was thinking about it, and it's like, if I was tasked with writing a fictional, night surrounding four figures that are this big, I'd almost feel silly about it, because it's like, like when you're in the script writing process and you write the name who's going to talk, and it's like, Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, etc. And it's like that I would feel like what am I doing trying to put words in these guys' mouths? So when you see how well the dialogue is, I love the confidence in Powers' writing that's coming through. That he was able to make it feel like these huge figures are just four dudes, just having these real conversations between the four of them. And that's another huge strength of this also. And you can kind of, maybe split them up a little bit, like have, like when you see Jim Brown and Ollie, and it's like these are two athletes, but they're on opposite sides, where Jim Brown's kind of going out of his sport, and Ollie's just starting to blow up in his. And then on the other side of this, you have Malcolm and Sam Cooke, and you can say that their thing is their voices, where it's Sam Cooke's singing voice, with Malcolm it's his speaking voice. And it's like the way they have these things that are who they are and define them. But at the same time, and that's just on like really simple terms. Like obviously you can, as far as speaking voice, you can also say that Ollie was obviously a famous speaker in his own right, even if in a different way than Malcolm. Still, it's a voice that we know, and that's the thing too. I want to point out about Eli Gorey specifically is that what's really great about what he does here is I feel like when you look at these four, Ollie is definitely the one where it would have been the easiest to just fall into like doing an impression, or like some sort of imitation. And I was afraid that was going to happen in the first kind of few scenes, but then like as it went on, you just like I said, they just start to feel like real people instead of these big figures you know from history books that you just kind of forget about it. And you're just kind of listening to what they're saying rather than always focusing on who they are, like in history and what they went on to become, or their names or whatever. And so there's that, and there's also talking about tricky things and how to approach the characters. Yeah, Kingsley Ben-Adir does also have a number of tasks here because when you're talking about playing big figures, um, he's in two shadows because he's got to be playing Malcolm, which has got to be daunting enough. But it's like he's also kind of in the shadow of Denzel having already played Malcolm. You could say the same thing about Eli Gorey and Will Smith as well. Um, but it's but having to be in the shadow of both Malcolm and Denzel, I can imagine it was not easy to like he did not just walk into this part like this. And he just like I said he owns it like the way they all own it. And like I said to the point that it feels they all feel like real enough characters that it's yeah, rather than that it's that can't be said that can't be overstated. So and I do like also some of King's. I mean, this could be the writing, but I also feel a lot of it is King as well. The idea of it being so dialogue driven, and whether or not it's going to feel like just a filmed play or whatever. The idea of when to make it just dialogue versus when to actually show it. Like when we get the scene when we hear about Sam Cooke in Boston and this performance that Malcolm witnessed. And that's the kind of thing where you could see it being really good dialogue, just having somebody explain it. Something that you see in plays that works so well. But the idea to show this scene and then the sort of stylistic way it's done, where it's when the crowd is chanting while he's singing, and then as Malcolm's describing it, he says, from where I was standing, I could only hear the chant. And then we're watching the scene, and then Cook's voice fades out, and we're watching him perform without hearing his voice, and we're only hearing the chant from the crowd. And it's like stuff like that really works also, and really shows that the choice between if you're going to do dialogue, then just do the dialogue really well to where we can see what they're talking about without actually having to be there. But then if you're going to show what it is they're talking about, be sure you give a reason why we needed to see this rather than just hear it described to us with really great dialogue. And to make the most of that with choices like that is just really standing out also. And so the interaction between all of them really work. I do think the strongest interaction, even if I don't think one particular cast member stands out, I do think the interactions that stand out the most will be between Kingsley Ben-Adir and Leslie Odom Jr. Especially when we get moments when he blows up at Malcolm, and he's got that great line of everybody wants a piece of the pie, I want the goddamn recipe. We get lines like that. And then that's sort of backed up by the moment when Malcolm plays, Bob Dylan for him and kind of proves something, and we see Cook kind of go into this whole thing of that should have been my song, and how he kind of has this realization, and that's basically the feel of the whole movie is them kind of having these, revelations and epiphanies and being these characters and the way they're making each other see things in different ways, and they're challenging each other and doing all this stuff, and it's one of those things where it seems like a nearly 2-hour movie and more or less one location would kind of struggle to keep the flow going. But like I said, there's such 4 strong characters who were such 4 big figures in history. It does not struggle to keep itself alive. So and then there's just kind of the whole thing in general of it always feels like there's something looming over because we know most of their fates at this point, and many of them tragic, and that whole thing of yeah, this whole like hypothetical scenario that this movie is, just gives it this really interesting quality. And like I said, if writing it without the confidence that Powers had, I would almost feel like it would be a silly concept to even try to imagine what this would be in this much depth. But it's definitely a hypothetical worth diving into. It turns out. So yeah. So I think that's going to be it for these three. I'm probably going to do just two random ones, two random movies I heard about recently, and just kind of explore them for the next thing. And then I guess we're doing awards videos, hopefully weekly now. We've got our Globe predictions on Saturday, which should be interesting. And yeah, and then Minari should be out by next week, I think, and then some other stuff. So Judas and the Black Messiah should be coming along before too long. And like I said, everybody seems to be sort of coming back now. We're gonna find our groove again now throughout this award season and onwards. So we'll see what happens with all that. So until the next thing, I think that's it.